title of my subject is A Hard Pill to Swallow, is a quote by Zadok Judd. The full quote is actually right here on the front cover. This was quite a hard pill to swallow, he says, to leave wives and children on the wild prairie, destitute and almost helpless, having nothing to rely on, only the kindness of neighbors, and to go to fight the battles of a government that had allowed some of its citizens to drive us from our homes. But the word comes from the right source and seemed to bring the spirit of conviction of its truth with it, and there was quite a number of our company volunteered, myself and brother among them. My background is, as far back as I can remember, I loved history. I think it came initially from my parents. As I went to school, they were actually still teaching history curriculum. I have a really wonderful 5th grade teacher. I even had a teacher in high school. As a teenager, I used to go to the old family history library and actually pull up the old microfiche and use the old machines. Now they have really nice ones. So I've always had an interest in history. I got involved in living history as the Sorensens did and the Cornells that you saw earlier. And I've been with them, for the Sorensens, for 30 years and the Cornells for 35 years. So we're like family. We all have different areas of expertise and talents. We pretty much make everything in our organization ourselves except for the shoes. We have that many people with that many talents. A couple of weeks ago, our group was actually involved at Sierra Park in Orem doing the largest colonial event west of the Mississippi. And as we were setting up, I was actually driving to Sierra Park, and I was listening to a radio show, and I heard this really cool quote. "Independence in America has no future without a reverence for its past." Kind of think about that. It really kind of touched me. In fact, as soon as I got out of the car, I ran up. It was actually Bree and Jared Cornell I saw first. I said, "Help me remember this quote. I just heard it on the radio." Why is it important to learn of history? Why is it important to not only learn it, but remember it? So I put down 5 things that I think why it's important for us to learn history. History helps us understand people and societies. Is that important? It really should be. Number 2, history helps us understand change and how the society we live in came to be. Kind of a quote that goes with that: the past causes the present, and so the future. The third item is to inspire us. History teaches us that a single individual with great conviction or a committed group can change the world. And really, if you think about it, we've been talking about that for the last several hours. Number 4, to help us develop essential skills in good citizenship. I'm seeing a generation that doesn't have those skills, but where do we learn the difference between good and bad character? Where do we learn about honorable men and women, those with integrity? It's through history. One of my favorite stories to teach about history, I know Jared, he likes to talk about Benedict Arnold and George Washington. Well, almost everybody knows them. I like to talk about Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan. And probably half of you don't know who Daniel Morgan is, but no time to talk about that today. But it has to do with character. Daniel Morgan had it. Benedict Arnold didn't. They experienced the same tragedy during the war. One went one way, one went the other because of good character. History provides identity. That's the 5th item. So it teaches us about our family. Winston Churchill stated, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And as I've done different research, it's sad to see it being repeated every day. That's another reason why we need to study history. The great American experiment, it was actually taught to us in 1 Nephi chapter 13. It talks about Christopher Columbus. It talks about the Revolutionary War. It talks about, for church members, the 2 books being brought together after the restoration of the gospel. Why am I talking about this stuff? You'll see really shortly. There's a phrase that I like to use when I talk to people about American history, and it ties directly into God's plan. And the phrase that I use is, America was conceived on July 4th, 1776, but she wasn't born until January 8th, 1815. You don't have to say anything. Can anybody know what happened on January 8th, 1815? Skylar and Mark, you should. So, y'all, I assume, know what happened on July 4th, 1776. That's when we declared our independence from Great Britain. But did we really receive respect from the rest of the world? England actually admitted later on that they didn't get beat. They just didn't have any more money to continue their fight. In fact, during that time period after the Revolutionary War, importation, exportation, it was difficult to conduct in America. When I would be the French, the British, the Spanish, were conscripting our sailors from the ships. They were doing everything they could to prevent us from becoming successful. And that's when the War of 1812 evolved. Now, this really hit home with me about 3 years ago. That's kind of when COVID happened, about the time they started tearing down statues. But there was also a school here in Utah that was named Jackson Elementary. The principal decided she needed to change the name because it represented a really horrible person. On January 8th, 1815, a man by the name of Andrew Jackson was sent with Kentucky and Tennessee volunteers. Initially, they went down to the territory of Florida, and the British at this time had already defeated Napoleon. And so they were sending those same troops that had defeated Napoleon here to America to finally put down this second war of independence. Andrew Jackson was told to take his volunteers and to take them to New Orleans. When he got there, he gathered what people he could. Now listen to this. He gathered free blacks. He gathered Choctaw Indians. He gathered French Creoles. He gathered Jean Lafitte's pirates, businessmen out of New Orleans, and amassed an army of about 6,000, mostly untrained militia. On January 15th, he went up against 12,000 British soldiers, the greatest military in the world. In 20 minutes, 1,200 British casualties to 13 American casualties. That's when America became a dot on the map. That's when America started to respect, when the world started to respect America. Now, just a few weeks early, on January 24th, what was happening? A young man by the name of Joseph Smith was celebrating his 9th birthday. We all know what his mission was. It wasn't until January 8th, 1815, that the doors opened for religious freedom, for the rest of the world to recognize us. And that's what happened after the Battle of New Orleans. Now, for 50 years, that date was celebrated just as the 4th of July was. You hardly ever hear it. In fact, I was there for the bicentennial in New Orleans for the bicentennial celebration, and there was hardly anything going on. Really sad. But that's what kind of opened the door to our freedom. Now, let's talk just really quickly. I lived 2 years in France, and I think they had like 6 revolutions over the centuries trying to duplicate American freedom. But they didn't understand what American freedom is. American freedom is not the right to do as we please, but the liberty to do what we ought. Think about that. American freedom is not the right to do as we please, but the liberty to do what we ought. It's a higher type of freedom. Of course, excitement over religious freedom evolved. Joseph Smith got older. 1830, the church was organized. And we won't get into a lot of the details because Wendy kind of helped me, but there's a few things I want to touch basis off of events that led up to the mustering of the Mormon Battalion. What really touches me is there are a lot of groups who have demanded what's that word? reparations for the damages done to them. And I agree to all of those. But does the church do that? Not to the degree that anybody else does. Okay, a few weeks ago I was at Topaz camp out by Delta. And if you haven't been there, you need to go there. It recognizes those Japanese that were put in a camp during World War II. And they have a wonderful display that talked about their constitutional rights not being given to them. And I'm in the middle of doing all this research, and the first thing that came to my mind is, well, what happened to the saints in 1846? When in February, early February, they're being forced out of their property. That included my ancestors, too. And a lot of them did receive nothing for their property. The same thing happened in Missouri. But you don't see us hounding to, we're too busy teaching the gospel. But let me cover a few of the items on my timeline. 1850, so Joseph and Hiram lost their lives in June of 1844. Those people who martyred those two men thought that would bring the downfall of the church. Obviously, it stirred up some issues, but it didn't destroy the church. A few months later, the forces of evil were once again unleashed on the saints. They started burning the houses and stealing and burning their crops. The outer settlements were being forced to abandon their settlements and go into Nauvoo. And September 2nd, it's entitled "The Voice of Illinois, the Saints Must Go." I think that was the title of an article in the Quincy, Illinois newspaper. Some of these people are the same people that welcomed the saints as they were being forced out of Missouri. Now they had a meeting, and they decided that it was time for the Mormons to leave. They printed that article, and a couple days later, the council, led by Brigham Young, gave a response. It says, the church's response to above, agreeing to leave, but requested to be given until spring next to avoid the trials and loss of life they had experienced in Missouri. So in that proposition, they were basically asking permission to wait till winter was gone. They had what they call the Great Anti-Mormon Convention held at Carthage on October 2nd, in which 9 counties were represented, and it was resolved that we can read that, resolved that it is the settled and deliberate conviction of this convention that it is too late to attempt the settlement of the difficulties in Hancock County upon any other basis than that of the removal of the Mormons from the state. And we therefore accept it and respectfully recommend to the people of the surrounding counties to accept the proposition made by the Mormons to remove from the state next spring and to wait with patience the time appointed for removal. And a lot of these documents, I have a copy of the full documents, and it's just appalling to me the lack of respect from other human beings for a group of people. Who was one of the biggest leaders he was a former counselor to Joseph Smith, that was one of the ones leading the cause. It's just, they had grievances, but to encourage people to destroy a whole group of people, that's just hard for me to understand. It's those things is why I study history, trying to understand. The end of October, Governor Ford kind of got involved, and Governor Ford concluded there was nothing that could be done to avert the inevitable, and that he could not force anyone to defend them, nor, quote, tolerate the expense of frequent military expeditions to defend them. Later on, Ford got involved with other people, drumming up false charges. We've heard this before. Same thing happened to Joseph and several of the leaders of the church in Missouri. They drummed up charges in order to get them incarcerated. We know what happened to Joseph and Hiram at Carthage. Now they're doing the same thing with Brigham Young and the council. And the charges they were trying to drum up had to do with counterfeiting currency. Now at that time, and I don't know where all the sources evolved from, but there was talk of the Mormons leaving, and that they would be taking all their arms. And so there were people who instilled in the minds of people who would listen that they were an armed force of Americans leaving the country. So they were using that as an excuse to try to get the U.S. government involved. In fact, Ford even wrote a letter to the council insinuating that. I don't see where that is, but he basically stated, let's see, Polk meets with. Okay, there was one more before that. Well, that one includes what I'm talking about, though. So on January 31st, Polk meets with Senator Assemble. He's one of the senators from Illinois, in relation to the intended immigration of the Mormons to Illinois, to Oregon. So first, Ford had written a letter to the Mormons insinuating that the U.S. government was going to send forces upon them. At about the same time, so he's playing kind of both ends of the spectrum here. He's writing President Polk, stating that they may want to consider sending forces against the Mormons. And Polk's response was that he doesn't have authority to do that. He's not going to interfere with the Mormons, the Baptists, or anybody else. So that's a kudos to President Polk. One thing I learned about President Polk, I think he was a pretty good president, but a lot of things he did wasn't, because his response was political, I guess is the short way of putting things. Now, what Wendy didn't get into too much, she talked a little bit about Jesse Little. She didn't mention Samuel Brannan, but Samuel Brannan was the president in charge of the Eastern States Saints, and he had gathered about 230 some odd saints to get a ship that would sail down and around and go to California. But actually they were saying they were going to Oregon, but we're not going to get into all these details. But there were a couple of men that got involved, and they were like wolves in sheep's clothing. They were after personal agendas, and they actually got Samuel Brannan to sign a contract that would, once the Mormons got to California, they would have to give half of the property back to Samuel, or back to E.G. Benson and Amos Kendall. Brigham Young was smart, and he didn't sign it. So she mentions some things about Amos Kendall. And he was a well-known politician, respected, but he had his own personal agenda. E.G. Benson was the one that wrote the letter of recommendation to Jesse Little to give to Amos Kendall. And they're kind of cohorts in this thing. So there's some things that Wendy didn't mention, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but you can look at the timeline here and see that some things don't add up. Jesse Little he was going around holding conferences at different towns with the saints, and he held one in Philadelphia. Okay, it's May 13th. So Thomas Kane, we'll get into him some more, but he actually heard Jesse Little talking, and asked for one of the members of the church to introduce him to Jesse Little. And they spent quite a bit of time together that day. I don't have time to get into all the details, but Jesse Little, and I hate to use this word, he was very dedicated to his cause, the instructions given to him by Brigham Young. I think he was a little bit naive about some of the goings-on around him. But what I've learned is he had somebody above watching over him. Jesse Little goes to Washington, D.C. He was involved in a public reception where somebody introduced him to President Polk. They really didn't have a discussion. The next day, he seeks out Amos Kendall and presents his letter of introduction from Benson, and they have a discussion. Now, what doesn't add up is when you start comparing Polk's journal to what Jesse Little states that Kendall is telling him, and what the final orders are to Kearney. So I think I believe that Kendall is telling things to Little that weren't necessarily coming from President Polk. And I don't think President Polk told everything he was doing with Amos Kendall. But would make this kind of short, what's really interesting is his friend, Thomas Kane, shows up on the 28th of May. And Thomas Kane, is friends with the vice president. He gets a meeting with President Polk. And the information we have on that visit comes from a letter. There's actually a copy of that letter in most of the documents I'm referring to right back here. But he talks about, to his brother Elijah, that he had this meeting with President Polk, and the discussion had to do with the Mormons. And I think there's 3 reasons at this point that Thomas Kane is involved. Kane's role became multifaceted in that he had a genuine sympathies towards the Mormons, he had personal aspirations, and he had a sense of patriotism, feeling what he was doing also helped the nation. So he had a fear that what the saints were about to do, and I don't think even the information Thomas Kane had was totally incorrect, but he thought they could be charged with treason if they did what they were doing. I think he had sympathies towards, there's a letter I have that kind of show that. I think he started to develop some sympathies. He was kind of a kind-hearted person and really wanted to help the downtrodden people. But he also had personal aspirations, and they kind of evolved day by day. I think he wanted to be the governor of California, a lot of different things. And speaking of California, you can see this map here. California back then was pretty much everything west of the Rocky Mountains and everything below the Oregon Territory. So when you see reference to California, it could be the Great Basin, it could be Cache Valley, it could be a whole lot of places. So keep that, when you're doing your studies, and that's something I had to realize, is California was a big area. President Polk, keep in mind that the war against Mexico was in full blown, and there's a lot for a president to deal with when there's a war going on. And I think he did kind of a pretty good job of communicating with his people. But there's another thing that most people have failed to remember, and that there was major issues with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. There was a dispute of where the border was. And there was moments at the time Jesse Little's trying to meet with the president's trying to figure out how he's going to prevent America from going to war against Great Britain again. So keep all that in mind. Kane actually meets with President Polk on 2 days in a row that he returns home to Philadelphia. And during this time period, and Wendy even mentioned that Thomas Kane became impatient. He thought that nothing was going on. There was things going on. He actually had bumped into Kendall on an occasion or two, and I think the information he was getting from Kendall was just to appease Kendall. It wasn't necessarily always the truth. But on June 1st, Little wrote his letter. Now, some think that maybe some of his words were somewhat treasonous. When you read the letter in its entirety and you study the words exchanged with Thomas Kane and Little in Philadelphia, and you understand the personalities of these two men, I think Little was just trying to pull from his heart his true feelings and the true condition of the saints. Now, he alluded that, maybe the saints would have to seek help elsewhere. He did it in a very politically correct way, and I don't think he was trying to prevent treason. But you as a president, if you're just about ready, thinking you could go to war with Great Britain, you're dealing with another war, and you have fears, there's one thing in the letter that Little wrote. He kind of stretched the numbers of saints that were in England. And so, I kind of put something in the mindset of President Polk, thinking there could be 20,000 members of the church ended up in the Oregon Territory that Great Britain could draw from. If you study history, it's almost impossible for that for the saints to actually done some of the things that they were alluding that they could do. Anyhow, you can see in the timeline there were cabinet meetings going on. It talks about these, what they were talking about. They were talking about, Polk had on his mind he wanted California. So this actually kind of helped play into what President Polk was trying to do. The thing that I haven't totally figured out is it was made very clear to Amos, Kendall, and Little that the Mormon Battalion would not be brought into service until they reached California. And that's in a couple different sources. However, sometime in that 24-hour period, and when William Marcy wrote his letter to Kearney, somehow that verbiage did not get transcribed. Now, did Polk and Marcy meet and have some sympathies, or did Marcy just not be clear? The letter is somewhat unclear. But Kearney interpreted as he needed to send somebody to the Iowa Territory to recruit the Mormons. And that's what he did. But this whole thing is the purpose of Jesse Little was actually to get money, either a loan or to get government contracts or something to try to generate funds for the church. And this whole thing just kind of came out of somewhere else. When Jesse Little, you can see on the timeline here, Kane came back into Washington, D.C. He was actually sick, and Jesse Little gave him a blessing, a priesthood blessing in a letter that he sent to him. And Kane, I guess, had respect for that, and he got up against the orders of his doctor and his parents and came to Washington and had some additional meetings with different politicians with Thomas Kane. But what they didn't know was the wheels were already in motion. And so a few days later, Thomas Kane and Jesse Little leave the council, Washington, D.C. They headed to St. Louis. They split. Jesse Little went to Nauvoo, and Thomas Kane headed down to Fort Leavenworth. Now, Jesse Little, he spent a week in Nauvoo. In his mind, that tells us that he felt that there would be no recruiting until the Saints got in California. Well, in the meantime, Kearney gets his letter. He interprets it as he needed to get 500 volunteers from the Mormons. He gets a hold of Captain Allen and sends him up. So this is what I'm going to try to slow down and get into some fun stories. I like the stories. June 14th is kind of an important date. That is when the lead companies, the Camp of Israel, actually arrived at the Missouri River. Now keep in mind, these guys, 2,000 Saints left Nauvoo in February, the middle of the winter, so their original plan got, changed because they feared that the U.S. government was going to send forces. And a lot of these Saints were not prepared. There was actually a list of things that they needed to take on the trek. They figured it would take 2 months. They needed to have so much food. And about half of the Saints that left there in February did not have the supplies that they needed. So they're dealing with this in the middle of the winter. They thought it would take 2 months to get from the Mississippi River to the Missouri River. Okay, they arrive on June 14th. That's 2 months after the expected date. What's going on is they're running out of, a lot of these people are running out of food. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But that's when the council arrived. The weather during this whole time period was terrible. I can't remember the name of the creek. There's one thing that's wrong on there. It's not William Phelps that wrote the song All Is Well. It's William Clayton. So keep that in mind. But the only reason why I mentioned that is because this is the conditions they were under. and they actually stopped at, does it say the name of this site? Something Creek, where he wrote the song. Anyhow, they didn't choose this place. This is where the wagons got bogged down in the mud. And so Brother Clayton, he was a captain of a company. They were forced to stay there for a period of time. His wife was pregnant back in Nauvoo. And he got word, this is in April. Yeah, it's in April. That's why I can't find its way back there. Yeah, April 15th. That's when he wrote someone came into camp and brought some news from Nauvoo that his wife had a baby, and that they were both doing well. They actually weren't doing well, but they did survive. But it so touched him that he wrote the words to All Is Well, which is now Come, Come Ye Saints. So the next time you sing that song, think about where William Clayton was and what was going on when he wrote that song, and then pay attention to those words. It kind of brings some new meaning to that song. But that became a favorite song for the Saints for many years. I've got it. It's actually Locust Creek. I had it written down somewhere. I knew that. So here's Iowa. So they traveled from Nauvoo. Sugar Creek was about 6-7 miles across the river. That was where they gathered the saints to prepare to go across. They created a couple of way stations. Mount Pisgah was a big one, but they also had one at Garden Grove. So in June, which we're talking about now, that's when they got to Council Bluffs, and that was going to be the third way station. Now, something people don't realize, it's just like President Polk was dealing with a lot of things, so was Brigham Young, and I've created a list as a full page, but so the council, this is what they're dealing with in June. They're developing and organizing way stations. Particularly, they were just starting to do the one at Council Bluffs, including establishing settlements, planting crops, establishing grazing areas for the sheep and cattle. There was just that job alone would keep an ordinary person very, very busy. They actually had an apostle that had apostatized, so they were in the process of replacing John Page. They were trying to complete the ferry that went across the Missouri River. They were dealing with false reports that continuously came in about the settlers were telling the government that the Mormons were conspiring with the Indians. So they were dealing with those issues. There were some major storms that took out a number of the bridges, and so they were dealing with repairing those damaged bridges. They were also dealing with the public arms out of Nauvoo, trying to get them across the Missouri River and out of the United States. So that was Hosea Stout that was dealing with that, and Charles C. Rich. They were actually trying to recruit about 500 men for the mountain mission just before Captain Allen comes in. This was a mission where they were going to send people to the Great Basin area across the mountains and start establishing crops and different things for them to travel in. They were dealing with reports, particularly of the Missourians sending militia forces against the Mormons. Concerns of the poor back in Nauvoo, they were dealing with how to get them out of Nauvoo. Continued rumors of the U.S. government forces being sent. I mean, they're trying to transverse 300 miles across the territory and trying to deal with all these things. You know, there's a few more here that I have, but time's getting short. So the council's just dealing with all this stuff. Now on June 26th, that's when Captain Allen arrives at Mount Pisgah. Now for about 48 hours, they were just getting hammered in that area with rain. And when they woke up, the saints woke up on the 26th, you know, they got some clouds clearing and seeing some blue sky, and they're dealing with trying to figure out how to dry everything out. And later in the day, they see military men coming into camp. Think about, with all these rumors going around, what would go through your mind? They talk about people hiding and fearing for what was just about ready to happen. So imagine you're one of these saints, you see military coming in. The leaders of the church there was William Huntington, Charles C. Rich, and Benson, Ezra T. Benson. And Wilford Woodruff was actually there at the time as well. So they all met with Captain Allen, and Wilford Woodruff and others. They were really skeptical about what he was trying to tell them initially. 15 minutes, thanks, Kevin. But they reluctantly allowed Captain Allen to communicate with the saints the next day. And there's all kinds of quotes we don't have time to get into those, the thoughts that were going through the minds of the people. We read the one from Taggart here early on. Immediately, the message is sent to the council and Brigham Young. I'm going to really condense a lot of this right now because I want to get to the stories. Captain Allen arrives on June 30th. The council had heads up before that. They'd already discussed what they were going to do. They met with Captain Allen on July 1st, and then they actually talked to Captain Allen, and Brigham Young and others spoke to the saints that were in the area at the time, stating that the Mormon Battalion needed to be formed. The next day, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richards basically assigned themselves as the recruiting officers, and they headed back east. They eventually got to Mount Pisgah. On the 5th there, on the timeline, it talks about Jesse Little finally arrives in the area. So on the 5th, he arrives at Mount Pisgah. The next day, he leaves early, and he actually runs into Brigham Young and his recruitment team on the way to Mount Pisgah. He joins the team and goes back to Mount Pisgah. At Mount Pisgah, they were continually doing recruitment speeches. Different members of the council, Brigham Young, they actually got 66 men to join at Mount Pisgah. Taggart George Washington Taggart was one of the men that signed up at Mount Pisgah. He was one of the many men that were assigned different duties of preparing the trail, acting as wagon drivers, moving wagons to different locations, and he had not seen his wife for quite a long period of time. And after some great thought and talking to some of the leaders, he decided that he needed to join, and he wrote a letter that day to his wife. Beloved and respected wife, it is with, here's a picture of him, it is with grief and disappointment, although with bright prospects of the future, that I sit down to pen a few lines to you concerning the sudden change that is about to come across my calculations. I expect the disappointment will be as great for you as to myself. I have calculated since the time I stepped at this place until this morning that I should see you in Eliza Ann before I left. But Brother Brigham Young and Kimball came here yesterday from Council Bluffs for the purpose of raising out of the camp 500 young men to send over the mountains this summer as United States troops under U.S. officers, the fact of which you will learn when you arrive here. I went to the council this morning and stated your situation as near I could calculate it might be at this time, and asked the council concerning the disposal of myself, and the counsel to me was that I had better go. And the letter's quite lengthy. It's really a heartfelt letter. The next day, some of these men that signed up, as well as Brigham Young and his recruiting committee, they head back towards Council Bluffs. Another man that had heard the speech from Brigham Young was a man by the name of Stephen S. Brown, James Stephen Brown. He was not a member of the church at the time. His family was. He went to church and different things. He was waiting for that special moment before he was going to get baptized. Well, that special moment happened during Brigham Young's speech. And so he actually went down to the river there and got baptized. He and several of the men on the 9th, they headed down towards Council Bluffs. And here, this is some interesting things to give you an idea of the struggles that they were going through. We bade our friends an affectionate farewell and started on what we understood to be a journey of 130 miles to the Bluffs to join the Army of the United States at our country's call. We had provisions enough to put up to last us on our trip. Our initial trip was begun without a blanket to wrap ourselves in, as we thought we could find shelter in the camps along the line of march. But in this we were mistaken, for everybody seemed to have all they could do to shelter their own. The first night we camped on the bank of a small stream, where we fell in with 12 or 15 other volunteers who had not much as a bit of bread. We divided with them and then scraped what leaves we could and laid down thereon with a chunk of wood for a pillow. I mean, the struggles, and it's just amazing what these men went through. The next day, James Brown writes again, "We journeyed much of the time in heavy rain and deep mud, sleeping on the wet ground without blankets or other kind of bedding, and living on elm bark and occasionally a small ration of buttermilk handed to us by humane sisters as we passed their tents." I mean, they're already struggling and suffering just trying to get to the bluffs. Get into a couple of my favorite stories here. During this time period, Thomas Kane arrived at the Bluffs. He spoke to the saints. They had these recruiting meetings going all the time. They created a camp where they had a liberty pole and flags. A lot of things were going on. On July 14th, this is something that touched me and kind of told me a little bit more about Thomas Kane. Thomas Kane was walking in the woods nearby with Henry G. Boyle. He's one that joined the battalion. And this is what we recorded. This is July 14th. It was about this day that Colonel Thomas L. Kane, still recovering from his illness, was taking a walk through the woods near the camp with Henry G. Boyle. They passed by a man praying in secret here near the edge of the woods. Brother Boyle wrote, "It seemed to affect Kane deeply. As we walked away, he observed that our people were a praying people, and that was evidence enough to him that we were sincere and honest in our faith. As they walked on, they walked near yet another man beginning to pray." These are men that are trying to figure out if they're going to leave their families and go on this trek. And Boyle wrote once again, "We had involuntarily taken off our hats as though we were in a sacred presence. I never can forget my feelings on that occasion, neither can I describe them, and yet the colonel was more deeply affected than I was. As he stood there, I could see the tears falling fast from his face, while his bosom swelled with the fullness of his emotions. And for some time after the man had arisen from his knees and walked away towards his encampment, the colonel sobbed like a child and could not trust himself to utter a word." This kind of starts to kind of tell us a little bit about Thomas Kane. I call this the dating period, but the marriage is arriving soon. A lot of things went on. The 15th, the 16th is referred to as the muster day. About 4.5 companies were formed. You can read there in my notes what was going on. I want to get into some more stories here really quick. Really quickly, you can see this graphic art piece here. I feel it represents the mothers who are letting their sons go. Mother Richards, Wealthy Dewey Richards, she had 5 sons. She lost one at Haun's Mill, was killed at Haun's Mill. Her next 2 oldest sons were actually recently sent on a mission, and she only had 2 sons left. And the one was Joseph, who was about 16, 17, and then a much younger son. And she actually relied on her son Joseph to help take care of the younger one. And she struggled about her son wanting to join the battalion. A few years later, a man writing of the situation, it was James Ferguson, he was a sergeant major in the battalion, he talks about the situation. An aged mother, there's a picture kind of her, to whom the call of the government and the wish of the president were made known, came forward. She had 5 sons, one was murdered, and now lay buried deep and unavenged in a tragic well in Missouri. 2 were on a foreign land preaching the faith for which their brother's blood was shed. One was still too young to administer, but needed care and comfort. The other was a young man, the sentinel and protector of her tutoring steps. Even in her aged heart, withered and broken as it was, the love of country burned deep and strong. She yielded up her son and never saw him again. 5 minutes, okay. Most of you are probably familiar with Drusilla Hendricks. Is there anybody not familiar with that? There's a YouTube video you can go and watch that we did. The sacrifice of this entire family is just amazing. And this family represents, all these individuals. But there's something I want to talk about in closing. I can go on and on with the stories. I love the stories. That's where we get a sense of what was going on. This people, they were a special people. Were they perfect? No. But how many of us could survive and go through what they went through? A movie came out probably 2 decades ago, Saving Private Ryan. According to veterans, the movie was very well done, depicting the invasion of D-Day. The story, though, although fiction, was based on some original accounts. So Tom Hanks was the captain, and he was given a squad of men, and their purpose was to find Private Ryan. Now, why? His 3 brothers, it was reported that his 3 brothers had been killed in action. And earlier in the war, the government allowed the men to sign up with any unit they want. They had 5 brothers sign up on the same naval ship, and that ship sunk, and all 5 sons lost their lives. So the government kind of changed how they were doing things and encouraged brothers to go in different units. Well, his brothers were in different units that's being represented, but they'd all died except for Private Ryan. So these men were given the task of trying to find Private Ryan. And whether it's fiction or not, it's based off of actual accounts. But what's important is what this squad of men were doing. They didn't understand why a potential sacrifice of all their lives to save one other life, why was 8 lives worth less than 1? But it was all about preserving this family. At the end of the movie, if you remember, most of the men in the squad were killed. Tom Hanks, who portrayed Captain So-and-so, was getting ready to die, and he had Private Ryan get close, bring his ear close, and he spoke 2 words: earn this. Think about what our founding fathers have done for us. Think about those men and women who have helped preserve the liberties that we have today in America. Think about those saints who gave their all so that we in this valley can worship the God that we wish. What are we doing as individuals to earn this? Probably the ultimate sacrifice was Jesus Christ. What are we doing individually to earn this? It's quite the legacy. Thank you.